Okay, on this video for Module 3, I wanted to talk about enrollment again. I know that I interviewed a registrar, and now I want to interview a person that is in charge, supervises school records. She's also a pupil personnel worker, but one of those duties inside with being a PPW, she also oversees school records as part of enrollment, and we'll get into that. But today I've invited Laura Thompson to come and talk with me.
Hi.
And we're going to talk about an array of topics, but for the first one, we're going to discuss enrollment. But before we do that, could you discuss with us and talk a little bit about your background, describe your job duties within the school system?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
So how far back do you want to go as far as background?
Just in general.
Okay, so just for the role of the PPW, I got my master's at Western Maryland, McDaniel College. I have a master's in counselor education and went on to become a school counselor. So I was a school counselor for a number of years up at a middle school in Tawnytown. And then gradually took more courses and ended up getting my PPW certification and applying to become a PPW in the school system. So I have been a PPW for the past 8 years. I started off in the southern region with 5 schools on my caseload, but for the past 3 years I have worked overseeing some programming such as home and hospital teaching, spent some time with home instruction, homelessness, and records and enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm currently PPW for our separate public day school, Carroll Springs School, and the post-secondary program that is housed there.
Okay. So and normally I've done this kind of at the end, and I want to just ask this: what was the hardest part of moving into the role of the PPW, and what have you learned over the years that you've been in it so far?
Okay. Honestly, I think the hardest part was leaving some of the relationships that I had developed with students at the school level. Not that I don't have that as a PPW, but I was very used to having daily interactions and relationships with some of those kids. So leaving the role of school counselor was a tough emotional part to learn that I was going to be out and about, going to multiple schools, interacting with multiple people. And while I still have relationships, much more on the go and quicker relationships, I guess you could say. Sometimes you're in and out of students' lives instead of being there every day. But that was also one of the things that I have loved about the job, is that I've gotten to meet many people and have all kinds of interactions at elementary, middle, and high school level. Another, I think, challenge was just learning, because sometimes reading a book is not the same thing as hands-on experience. Learning all the policies and procedures of a specific school system, learning the ins and outs of, how do I get a child into an alternative program? What is the paperwork involved with that? How do we get children into our school system that have hardship situations? All those kind of nuances that, yes, you can study and learn about, but until you get to do them, that I think is the challenge of being a PPW. I learn new things every day.
And as my supervisor once told me, it'll take about 3 years for you to get your feet about you, and 5 to just be comfortable in all the things that come at you all the time. And one of the things that will come at you will be that of the process of enrollment in schools. So I want to talk about in some general terms about enrollment. I know we ask a registrar some of these similar questions, but to hear it from a different perspective might also help you too. Okay? So the first one about enrollment: discuss the general requirements for enrollment for a kid to come into our system.
Okay, so the first thing is that we need to have a parent do the registration, and that can be a biological parent that has guardianship over the child. It can be a custodial guardianship situation where perhaps there's been somebody appointed through the court system to be a child's guardian. It can be an adoptive parent. There are occasions where we have exceptions where the Student Services Department has deemed someone a guardian through an appropriate application, which I think we'll get to later in the session. But for the most part, you need a parent to provide proof of who they are. And there are 3 general main documents that we need for a student to be enrolled. One is we call it proof of birth or proof of age. We want to make sure that a child, that we know what their legal name is and that they are the correct age to start kindergarten or whatever subsequent grade they're enrolling in. The second thing is a proof of residence. So we want to know, are you enrolling in a school, in a district where you reside? And if not, we are looking at what kind of exception are we making here. Is it are you applying for out of district, wanting to go to a school that is not where you live but within county? Or are we looking at some kind of special circumstance where someone doesn't live in Carroll County and they're applying to go to a school? And thirdly, an immunization record. We want to make sure that everybody is up to date on their immunizations and we want to keep our kids safe. So we want to make sure that everybody that comes in has proper immunizations. So the three things: proof of birth, proof of residency, and proof of immunizations.
And they also have to provide an ID. What if we've run into situations where they don't have an ID, especially if they come from, a border, they've come to the border, they've been detained, they don't have IDs, or any exceptions to that? And how do we work around that?
That can be a challenge. Sometimes, if we're talking about a student, sometimes if they are picked up at the border, they might be issued a special document that indicates who they are. If they're placed with a caretaker or a relative, then we're going to look through special, we call it non-resident paperwork, or a child could be deemed unaccompanied homeless.
Yes.
In which case we're going to try to do what we can to expedite enrollment. But generally, if a child has come from another school system, we can also try to look at the documents that are coming from another school. What were the enrollment papers? Were there any court papers indicating who the guardians are? Mm-hmm. It is tricky without an ID, but sometimes the role of the PPW is to help dig and uncover, what can we do to prove that this person is a parent?
Right. And I think that is probably the trickiest thing that we try to solve. But let's kind of move on. What exceptions are made in the enrollment documents with birth certificates, immunizations, proof of residence, if they don't seem to have those items?
That's a great question, and I get a lot of these questions. How can we try to work around or come up with alternatives when the standard documents are not available? As far as birth certificate, we accept a variety of different proof of births. So a birth certificate or a registration, but we also accept physician's verifications. We accept court orders that might have a child's birth date listed in them. We accept passports. We even accept prior school records if the child's birth date is on one of those documents. But one of my fallbacks is we have an affidavit of birth. And so when all else fails, and we've gone through our slew of approvable documents we can accept for birth, a parent can fill out basically swearing what the child's legal name is, birth date, where they were born, and the PPW can sign off on that document. So we might still encourage the parent to try to go to the health department and get a legal birth certificate, but in the meantime, that might be a fallback. Immunizations, the health department also, again, can sometimes step in and help us recreate that document or give students, within safety, particularly students coming from other countries that may be lacking an immunization record, without duplicating, per se, immunizations. There are certain ones they could get for safety that, may be needed for school. But also, especially with our little kids coming into kindergarten, they're not always up to date with everything that they need. A parent can fill out a form that's good for 20 days. As long as they have an appointment to get their immunizations, we can let them enroll for that 20-day time period. The thing we have to caution is nurses and registrars need to be mindful that as that 20 days approaching, we're really reminding parents or having the PPW assist parents in getting in and getting those immunizations complete. Because we don't want to have to hold a child out, but that would result if we don't have the immunizations complete.
And to that, today I was in a meeting with two students that are coming from El Salvador, and they did not have their immunizations. And so as part of that process, we had them fill out the document that they'll need to take to the health department, and oftentimes the health department will fax it to the school so that there is evidence that the appointment has been scheduled, and that allows us to move forward with enrollment. And there are times when you have to exclude but we do everything we can not to have that happen.
Right, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so now, kind of moving on, talk about how schools collaborate and communicate when students move from school to school and within the county or the state or even the country. Why is this so important?
Yes. And one of my roles in working with records and enrollment is that I'm constantly collaborating both with school registrars and with actually our tech service department in cleaning up all kinds of, making sure that things match. So the first thing, I think maybe it's my background as a counselor, is I never want to lose children. So we want to make sure for kids' safety that there's a continuous enrollment. They're moving from one school, lined up to enroll in another school. Within county, that is obviously much easier to do because schools are collaborating and communicating. What we have statewide is called a Student Record Card 7. It's a transfer document. And the school that knows the child is leaving, they can fill out this transfer form. They'll attach a child's proof of birth and immunizations, any current grades or test scores, their transcripts. And the goal is to facilitate the transfer so that a parent can take that packet to the next school. It doesn't replace enrollment, but it helps facilitate enrollment. And then when that child registers at the new school is required to send a records request to the previous school. So that previous school knows, okay, I've gotten official word the child is elsewhere, I can transfer them out. So what we have within the county and actually within the state is an electronic system where we have codes, fancy codes, that are used, they're not that fancy, but codes that transfer students from one school to another. And the different codes indicate if it's within county, within state, out of state, and what our tech services department is often charged with doing is making sure that those things match up between counties. So if a child leaves Carroll County and we say they're transferring to Frederick County, that Frederick County actually picks that child up in their computer system. And this process goes on throughout the year, but particularly 3 times a year, the State Department does a mass matchup. And we're told about the mismatches and we're asked to fix them. So the other, I guess, piece of why is it important to track these kids is only one school at a time can claim funding for a child. And so that's where where we make an effort not to duplicate. That if we're claiming a child, there can't be another school district claiming a child. So we have to make sure that we're actually taking a child out on their last day of attendance here, and that other school is picking them up when they actually start. If for some reason there's some, an electronic overlap, we've got to figure out where the issue is. But as I said, I also worry about kids who, part of the PPW's role is to make sure kids get safely where they're supposed to be. So if they're leaving the state and a family says, I'm moving to Colorado, here's the town I'm moving to, if we don't get a records request in a reasonably timely fashion, we might be calling out there to say, did this child at least land in your school? Okay, if they don't want to send us a records request, but I want to know, did a child get where they needed to be, particularly out of state? Because we don't have that computer system matchup. But that's more for me worrying about children and making sure that they are
And sometimes
educated.
when we don't get those records requests, as part of the documentation about kids moving from one school to the next, especially when it's to another county or another state, then the PPW will write a memo saying I've had a conversation with a school official, or had documenting a conversation with a parent, indicating where the child has gone, so that we might have a record of where they went. Okay?
Yeah.
And so the next one, connected to those school records, what are some of the most common errors that we get when those records are looked at?
Right, okay, and so there are paper records where we're required to keep certain documents in a cumulative folder for a child, and that folder travels from school to school, in county and in state. And so in that folder, we're talking about enrollment documents being completed, an appropriate proof of birth, an appropriate proof of residence, hard cards. Some counties still use what are called hard card record cards that has attendance, transcripts, test scores. Our county happens to have moved to an electronic system, but we can print those cards. So if a child is leaving the county, we may print those and put them in the folder. Report cards. Common problems that I tend to see, because those are manual pieces of documents. Might be you've taken a proof of residency from someone and it wasn't an acceptable document, or it's out of date. We ask that bills be accepted, like utility bills are dated within 60 days of enrollment.
Right.
So those are those, manual errors that we may find, or documents might have gotten misplaced over time. If we get a record into our school system that is missing something, we have a nice little sheet that we put in there and say, when this was received, XYZ was missing, move on.
Right.
We try to recreate if possible. If we discover something's missing, then we can always call a parent and say, we're sorry, we discovered this document is missing, can you help us catch up and get that up to date?
And so I think we're always looking at these records because they're always being audited, tied to the funding of
Right.
students. And so I think that
Right.
kind of, you'll talk maybe about that in this question. Why is this process, we have such strict procedures about how we go about doing it?
Yes.
And what's the role of the PPW in trying to make that, being a gatekeeper, making that happen?
Right. And probably I didn't realize how detail-oriented we are until becoming a PPW, that every child is accounted for. The State Department will send out auditors every other year, and they'll randomly select about 400 student records from the school system, from our county. And it might be different depending on the size of the county, but for us it's about 400 records. And they want to look at, they're trying to show that, or look as to whether we proved that the child legitimately lived in our county because we claimed funding for them. So every year the school system sends an exact count of the students enrolled in our school system and who we're claiming, and we get funding for every single one of those children. So when they're auditing us, they want to see the attendance records. They want to see the proof of residence. Did the child legitimately live in your county, or were they approved under a special circumstance, and do you have that documentation there? They want to look at the immunization records. They want to see, was the child appropriately up to date with their shots in order to be in school? So it's all about claiming children from that aspect. The funding is based on whether we legitimately enrolled a child properly. What you don't want to do is claim a child that never showed up to school that year. Like, we have to make sure, and what they do is they do a head count as of September 30th.
Right.
So we have a month of time there in the beginning where we're tracking kids, making sure that if they're not here any longer, if they've moved away, they're just too ill to be in school, whatever the reason is, the PPWs especially are involved in checking every one of those kids and making sure that we have accounted for them, either that we take them off the rolls or that we specifically exclude them from a funding claim, which we can do. If there's a need to keep a child on the rolls due to illness or truancy, but we're worried that they're not going to show up shortly thereafter, then we can say we're excluding this name from the submission. Yeah.
And the general questions about enrollment, I think that kind of wraps it up about why it's important in your role. I mean, like the registrar said that I interviewed in the last video that I posted, you have to have a working relationship with those registrars. And you have to give them direction, and they have to give you information so that you know kind of next steps or what direction you might have to take. But it's important to be connected to them. Anything else you would add about enrollment that we haven't talked about?
As far as being a PPW, that we're often there to support parents. It's not our job to do everything for them. Sometimes there's a careful balance between assisting and enabling. We don't want to get the documents for them per se, but there are times where parents are really trying. They may not have a proof of residence. A PPW could, for example, do a home visit. The documents for 30 days, time to buy that parent time to get an appropriate document. We can assist in getting, we can do a little bit of digging and investigating. And our role to support the registrars as well. They may have questions. There are so many different details that go into registering a child. So our role is to be both supportive of the parent and the school.
Yeah. I think there's exceptions too with homeless enrollments, allowing those enrollments to move forward, but the PPW comes back with the family and works with them to get the required documents. Just because you're homeless doesn't mean that you're not still required to provide those things with the support of the school system. So I want to thank you so much for kind of talking in detail about some of the things that connect to enrollment. And so you'll use this information to maybe help you better answer some of the scenarios that I posted. And until next time, we'll see you soon.